Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaskar, this is second lecture. In this lecture, we will try to see that all those many cornerstones which have emerged from historical trajectory of scientific development. What are these cornerstones? These cornerstones became milestones for social sciences, as we touched upon in the previous lecture. In the coming century, all those cornerstones become very important milestones to look at very religiously for some of us doing social sciences. We would selectively read some of these philosophical contributions. To begin with, we return to René Descartes and his meditations, which provided the most important component in the epistemology of science. So, what did René Descartes come up from his meditations? He came up with a method. It was a method of and justification for doubting. His 6 meditations or theses are crucial. The first one nearly forced us to believe that we can doubt all, particularly material things. The second meditation, second thesis, suggests that we are all free mind, and a free mind can distinguish intellectual pertaining to mind and sensational pertaining to body. Thirdly, the idea of there is an idea that we can possess an idea and which is almost like God. God can have only God as its cause, just like an idea of a perfect machine originates in the mind of its maker. So, this third thesis is very interesting, where he tries to draw parallel between a pure idea and an unquestionable God. An unquestionably pure idea and unquestionably pure divinity. Fourth meditation talks about the certainty of geometrical demonstrations, and that these certain variety of geometrical demonstrations depend on the knowledge of God. And lastly, the sixth one sets the methodological debate. The sixth one is about the distinction of intellect and imagination, mind and body, though they are closely conjoined to be a single entity, but Descartes' interest is to show the distinction between the two in each of the binary opposite. And more crucially, this was meant to suggest that reason or good sense, as he says, is commonly and equally inherent in all humans. This good sense and innate capability to reason is distinguishable from the bodily sensations, which one can wonder whether bodily sensations are bad sense. Anyone can, if willing, doubt and distinguish the good sense from the rest of the sensation. The intellect can be distinguished from the rest of the body. Dwelling upon the mathematical idea of incontrovertible, Descartes persuades us to find indubitable, and he says, and I quote, he says that find indubitable and under quote reject as completely false everything in which I could detect the least doubt, in order to see if anything thereafter remained in my belief that was completely indubitable. Quote ends. imagination need not lead to what things are. Instead, it is an active work of I that does. The idea of I am thinking, therefore I exist, leads to the traumatic realization that if I had merely ceased thinking, I would have no reason to believe that I existed, even if everything else I had ever imagined has been true. I, as a thinking thing, can doubt, can understand, can conceive, can affirm, deny, will, imagine, and feel. This I, with its power to reason, is also known as cogito. An earlier hint of this idea was in the treatise of a Christian theologian named St. Augustine, who happened to be roughly in between 300 and 400 AD. However, it acquired such prominence only in the Cartesian epistemology. It emphasizes that the truth or falsity of my imagination requires me to be actively engaged in thinking, and in turn, the existence of I resides in thinking. So distinct from the rest of the body is this I that it would not stop being everything it is. Even if the body were not to exist, it will be everything that a body would be known for. This is what sculpts the I as such a perfect thing, independent of sensuous body and corporeal things in the realm of the sensory and thereof feelings. This I, this Cartesian I, resonates with another perfect being such as God. Just like this Cartesian I is a pure entity, indubitable, not possible to be subjected to any kind of doubting. Likewise, God is a pure entity, indubitable, cannot be subject to any kind of doubting. This is akin to the incontrovertible, such as the idea of a triangle or an equidistance of the sphere from its center. This kind of geometrical metaphors become very axiomatic in understanding Cartesian thesis on the purity of I, the purity of intellect, and the purity of divine as incontrovertible entities. As we have noted, the Cartesian philosophy thus accomplishes a mind-body dualism. This is something very famously known, and it's been criticized by various commentators and philosophers who indulged in contestation. They contested about this idea, this Cartesian dualism. This Cartesian dualism originally was a formulation by Plato in the light of the Christian theological ideas. This works for distinguishing three kinds of ideas: innate ideas within the realm of an individuated I; secondly, foreign ideas that come from without; and ideas, thirdly, invented by an individual. Except the innate ideas, Descartes deems other two dubious, doubtful, not trustworthy, and he continues to put premium on I, allowing a lapse to subjectivism of some sort. One could underline manifold inconsistencies, but what matters for this discussion, for our discussion, is an extraordinary characteristic of the knower to be an I, that is a thinking thing, and thus be able to steer clear of anything that can emerge from any other sources. This is very important for our discussion. This is a very important feature of modern scientific epistemology, where this extraordinary characteristic of I becomes sharply noticeable. Much of Cartesian formulations constituted the premise upon which philosophical empiricism of science could be founded. Influenced by Descartes, notwithstanding, John Locke departed from the Cartesian thesis of innate ideas vis-a-vis a priori, something which is before me, before anyone else, before anybody's experience, there is innate ideas. Locke noted it as a residue of the scholastic and Plato, which ought to be corrected in scientific observation. He sought to develop empiricism as scientific methodology in the essay concerning human understanding. In this regard, steering clear of syllogistic reasoning, Locke propounded an idea of reason, as Bertrand Russell elsewhere paraphrases, tries to paraphrase John Locke, and this is under quote that I am going to say, God has not been so sparing to men to make them barely two-legged creatures, and left it to Aristotle to make them rational. So, basically Russell in this paraphrase is trying to communicate to us what Locke had in his mind, and what he had in his mind was that every individual is capable of being rational independent of an Aristotle or Plato or any of those sources of wisdom, and therefore he is expecting us to undertake a journey of philosophy where he could show that every individual is capable of becoming rational by his or her own will and own capacity. Being rational is not a prerogative of a wise philosopher such as Aristotle in this whole discourse of John Locke. Instead, it is within the reach of any specially abled investigator. For Locke, reason is dual. It includes inquiry that leads to knowledge with certainty, and investigation of the probable propositions that may be wise to practice, though it may not bear certainty. The probable nature of a proposition dwells upon one's own experience or that of others. In short, reason enables to get to a variety of experiences through which one gets to ideas. Ideas are derived from two sources broadly: sensation, which involves sense organs, and perception, which involves mind as internal sense. Of course, it has a bit of inconsistency in formulation, but with that inconsistency, John Locke further adds that there are three kinds of knowledge of real existence. One is intuitive knowledge of our own existence. The second is demonstrative knowledge of God's existence, and the third is sensitive knowledge of things that come from senses. The intuitive knowledge is accessible through our experiences that our reason can aid in getting at. The demonstrative knowledge, also known to be knowledge accessed through reason, presupposes agreement or disagreement between two or more ideas, and likewise reason can enable us to arrive at knowledge that arises from our senses. So, what is he trying to do, John Locke, by saying all these things? He is trying to say that all our knowledge is thus acquisition of these ideas with dual reasoning, as though inscriptions on tabula rasa, which means a blank slate. All our knowledge is thus acquisition of these ideas with dual reasoning, as though all these knowledge are inscriptions on tabula rasa, a blank slate. So, we are all blank slate, and anything that we know is actually inscribed on us with the aid of reason. It is inscribed on us, and they are all acquired ideas. None of our knowledge, following John Locke's empiricism, antedate experience. Knowledge is never before experience, it is always with and after experience. This was a bold innovation that refuted philosophical positions from Plato down to Descartes and also Leibniz, which had separated knowing and knowledge from sensation, perception and experience. However, Locke could not settle a paradox, very interesting kind of paradox, a paradox which takes us to another side of Enlightenment philosophy. And the paradox was, if sensation has a cause, why shall it be dependent on experience for understanding? If it has some cause somewhere else, then why someone who is trying to understand it should depend on experience? Instead, one should try to look for that cause, right? This is an interesting epistemological puzzle that gives rise to philosophical skepticism. You will understand the puzzle a little more when you see that it points out an inherently essentialist notion of experience, which was emphasized in John Locke's formulation. An essentialist notion of experience whereby experience becomes a complete entity by itself. For everything, one has to dwell upon experience, and that kind of essentialism of experience that comes from John Locke is subject to further interrogation in some other variety of philosophical rumination. The experientialist empiricism of John Locke does not satisfy when one asks a simple question informed by skepticism. And what is that question? One knows the cause and effect that is involved in the love relations. One understands the cause and effect in biological, anatomical sense. One understands hormones responsible. It may be well, though, explained by holding the hormones responsible. Yet every lover and beloved longs to write a detailed, even melodramatic story about the experience of love. Is this notion of experiential narrative different from what John Locke's empiricism offers us? Yes, it is, in the sense that the detailed narration of experience that may be a common tendency of the folk in everyday life may not be so common for the scientists who seek to explain the experiments. The scientists would be content with causal explanation about the experience of experimenting. This causal explanation of a scientist's experienced experiment did not have the detailed narrative that could, for the sake of imagination, explain how the scientist came to think of the experiment under discussion. How did he experience, if I have to ask this question, how did he experience when the experiment was underway? Was there a sense of trepidation, fear, and did the scientist's personal, emotional, biographical part come to play any role in the experience of the experiment? And so forth. Such details are methodically left aside in a scientist's explanation on cause and effect. And this is what constitutes Locke's experiential explanation in the last analysis. But for David Hume, there is always something more to the causal explanation, and that is very typical of Hume's skepticism. He asks for something more than causal explanation. He says that there is a large domain of uncertainty that calls for what we can call juicy stories in the scheme of explanation. It is with Hume that we begin to understand that a child witnessing the steady rise of an early morning crimson sun in the eastern horizon, spreading the wings of soothing saffron, is an invitation for a different experiential narrative that includes the causal explanation only as a basic technical requirement. Every child knows the causal explanation for the rising sun, but a child goes on making various drawings, creating different kind of rhymes about it. So there is something more than causal explanation. That is what is coming through from this kind of experiential narratives. We witness an old tree, say for example, standing rooted with many branches spread across the space, and we can instantly indulge in amateur poetry or sketching. This is a qualitatively different domain of experiential knowledge, fraught with subjective uncertainty that concerns a skeptic such as David Hume. This is a line of curiosity that enabled David Hume to propose a skeptical stance. We don't perceive our brain, our own brain, and yet we have an idea of it. Hume is interested in uncertain knowledge that could emerge from empirical data by inferences and yet could not be sufficiently demonstrative. He goes on suggesting that only in algebra and in arithmetic there could be reasoning with certainty, which begins to thin as we enter something like geometry, since we can seldom be sure of the truth claims of the axioms in geometry. Axioms are those truth claims which are not questioned in geometry. I mean, on the ground of axioms one tries to prove a theorem. We prove theorems premised on axioms in geometry, and that is what creates that gray area within geometry. Thus, most of our ideas related to spatio-temporal relations or identity dwell upon impressions, whereas causation allows us to infer from one occurrence or another. It boils down to a bottom line. We can only know cause and effect from our experiences with certainty. Rest is a game of impressions as we try to infer from experiences of cause and effect. In other words, what appears to us as necessary connection among objects is really only connection among the ideas of those objects that our mind, influenced by custom or a set of inherited notions, our mind delivers in this kind of conditioning, our mind delivers those ideas to us. As a strong proponent of skepticism in modern philosophy, David Hume adds uncertainty to the certainty promised in scientific epistemology, even though maintaining the role of reason in the process of knowing. So, role of reason intact, but the element of uncertainty is put alongside the element of uncertainty in the whole process of knowing. And it is aptly summarized when he suggests there is no such thing as a rational philosophy. If we believe that fire warms or water refreshes, this is only because it costs us too much pain to think otherwise. Bertrand Russell expressed his discomfort with Hume's skepticism. As I also hinted in the previous lecture, he considered this skepticism responsible for the growth of unreason and destruction of empiricism throughout the 19th century and 20th century. This paved the way for further complexity with the works of philosophers such as Rousseau, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, in continuity with David Hume. The dilemma whether knowledge is a priori or accumulation of experiences thus remained unresolved by far in the Enlightenment philosophy. However, one began to notice that scientific epistemology has become richer with some of these antithetical notions emerging in the philosophical debate. Whether knowledge is innate or acquired could not be solved. At best, it took a turn when unresolved problems of mind were left for a romantic resolve offered by heart, as it were. The late 18th century witnessed the regime of heart-based philosophy, so to say. In this regard, the name of Rousseau, among others, seems to be prominent. German idealism in affinity with the Romantic movement, offered a nuanced critique of scientific way of thinking. Names of Hegel, Fichte, Schelling and Kant were prominent. However, Kant is of crucial significance with his philosophically nuanced synthesis of the stances of his predecessors and finding a possible answer to the dilemma of a priori and posteriori character of knowledge. He tried offering that kind of resolve through a synthesis of various positions. Though educated in Leibniz philosophy, steeped in Hume and Rousseau, there is an evident systematization of the position that makes Kant a responsible teacher of philosophy. The most important of his work, The Critique of Pure Reason, the first edition of which appeared in 1781, is noted for cardinal significance in the discussion on scientific epistemology. Starting with a proposition that restores experience, rescuing it from romantic and skeptic doubts as predominant, Kant tries to suggest that experience is without doubt the most important category throughout scientific epistemology, and that requires a very detailed kind of discursive engagement which appears in Kant in utmost candidness. This is lecture 2, part 2. This has to be added in the part 1 of lecture 2. So, we were talking about Immanuel Kant's contribution to scientific epistemology. We got to understand that Kant is operating with a rich background in which there are contestation about the nature of knowledge. In order to develop scientific epistemology, many of the Enlightenment philosophers were contributing to the trope of discussion, giving us clarity about what knowledge could be, what knowledge could be constituted by, and how to approach knowledge in a particular way of doing things, in scientific way of seeing how to see the category of knowledge. And it is in that backdrop that we look at Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, who writes in something which many of the commentators have called Miltonic sublimity, this Miltonic style that appears in Kantian prose and also in the way Kant would handle some of the questions. It entails great deal of philosophical sophistication, no doubt about that. At times it becomes inaccessible due to the sophistry involved, but even then one does not fail to fathom what Kant is trying to offer us, particularly when it comes to the field of scientific epistemology. So, as I noted in the previous part of this lecture, the work The Critique of Pure Reason, which came, the first edition of which came in 1781, it was considered extremely significant for discussion on scientific epistemology. The work restores experience. It brings back the significance of experience which is going through contestation on the trope of philosophy, empiricist and non-empiricists, whether it is a priori or posteriori, that kind of contestation about experience, and experience is brought back. It is almost rescued in Kantian discussion from romantic and skeptic doubts. And Kant says it very clearly, and I am quoting Kant. He says, under quote, "Experience is without doubt the first product that our understanding brings forth." I repeat, experience is without doubt the first product that our understanding brings forth, as it works on the raw material of sensible sensations. Quote ends here. the idea, the key word is, there are quite a few key words here. Sensible sensations is one of the most important keywords. Though experience is important in this whole formulation, as you can see, Kant does not dismiss the sensible sensations. Experience, which is important even for an empiricist, experience which is inscribed on tabula rasa for an empiricist. However, sensible sensations which may arise from some of those domains of experiencing which are not directly accessible to your five sense organs, which may be very subjective kind of ideas arising from various domains of experiences. Those sensible sensations are also given its due in Kantian framework, in addition to recognizing the importance of experience. And getting into the details, Kant would propose something that reconciles different positions in the debates on scientific knowledge. Kant proposes knowledge to be bound by experience. Sorry. Knowledge is essentially to be experiential in nature. It is supposed to be a posteriori, which means it is supposed to be something which has been acquired through experience, as well as it is supposed to be independent a priori cognitions. This bringing together of the two poles, posteriori and a priori, is extremely important in Kantian formulation. Hence, a part of it could be inferred from experience, a part of knowledge could be inferred from experience, while there is an equally large part, a large domain of knowledge that is beyond the scheme of experience. This is quite ingenious of Immanuel Kant to have underlined this large swath of knowledge which can be beyond the scheme of experience. We can't experience, but we know. They have been handed out to us, they have been transacted to us, they have appeared from generation to generation, and in spite of the lack of possibility of investigating into the veracity of those understandings, we know that they are there. So, they are beyond scheme of experience. Likewise, Kant operates with the scheme of propositions or judgments that could be, following Kant, divided into two parts. There is one type of propositions or judgments which are called analytic judgment, analytic propositions, and they are substantial part of whatever we know. Analytic proposition is of affirmative nature. In an analytic statement, somebody tries to affirm and reaffirm something. You try to say that yes, this is how it is. That is an analytic proposition, and you say it with great deal of confidence and clarity that yes, this is how it is. On the other hand, there is synthetic proposition, and in a synthetic proposition, your objective is not to get into this business of affirming. We will get to understand what synthetic and analytic means. We understand it better when we look at some of the examples. In an analytic proposition, the predicate is part of the subject. You can see that Immanuel Kant plays with the terms which are to indicate parts of a sentence. So, there is subject and there is a predicate in a sentence, and we are familiar with these basics about the structure of a sentence from our school days training in English grammar and all. So, Kant says that in an analytic proposition, the predicate is part of the subject. Say for example, he gives an example, a tall man is a man. Interesting. A tall man is a man. Or take another example, another Kantian example. An equilateral triangle is a triangle. An equilateral triangle is a triangle. Such propositions are basically judgment of clarification. They try to, in a very clear manner, clarify things for you, leave no room for any doubt. These are judgment of clarification, and they operate with a very paradoxical kind of law of contradiction. There is this very logical thing in the backdrop of this statement, this kind of statements, this kind of analytic propositions will have this logic in the backdrop that if you try to contradict those statements, you fall flat. So, law of contradictions, and hence if you try to make an opposite articulation, an articulation which will be opposed to an analytic statement, you may not go very far with that kind of opposite articulation. Say for example, if you try to say that an equilateral triangle is not a triangle, as opposed to an analytic statement which said an equilateral triangle is a triangle. So, the statement in opposition that equilateral triangle is not a triangle will be self contradictory, because by the very fundamental information, following that fundamental information, a triangle will have 3 sides, and therefore it is called a triangle, and each side of a triangle will be equilateral, therefore it is called triangle. So, it operates, analytic statement operates with this logic in the backdrop that if you try to contradict them, the contradictory statement would fall flat. Interestingly, like in the same way, if you try to say that a tall man is an analytic statement, and if you try to contradict it by saying that a tall man is not a man, then you understand that the statement in opposition to analytic statement falls flat. Why? Because if tall man is not a man, then why are you saying this in the first place, that there is a tall man? Then the whole purpose of presenting this statement becomes redundant, so and so forth. Likewise, one can get into very fantastic discussion exploring the length and breadth of the nature of an analytic statement with variety of examples. It's really fascinating, an area to ponder upon, and I would like a lot of my students to spend little time in enjoying the nature of this component of our bodies of knowledge that we gather, that we accumulate through our trainings in various disciplines. Analytical propositions thus have a win-win effect in a discourse, be it in science or socio-cultural world. Without asking for more evidences, they stand firm. An analytical statement, an analytic proposition will be easier to engage with, because they do not hold too much of confusion for us. For the receiver, for the seeker of knowledge, it's not too confusing. But on the contrary, the synthetic propositions, which are basically judgment of amplification. Judgment of amplification means something which tries to add more layers to a statement, something which invites you to go for an exercise in broadening an idea. So, synthetic propositions are judgment of amplifications, and they are known only through experience. An amplification would not be complete unless it involves an experiential inquiry, or an inquiry based on experiences, and hence any amount of conceptual analysis alone cannot lead to it. A synthetic proposition, a grasp of synthetic proposition requires us to do a little more than conceptual analysis. Say for example, one comes across this example quite often. Tuesday was a wet day, which means that somebody has seen or heard or experienced some amount of shower, some amount of rain on this particular day, which was Tuesday, and therefore one is saying, with due amount of poetic involved, with due amount of imagination involved, and with due amount of recalling from memory involved, and one is saying Tuesday was a wet day. Of course, this statement Tuesday was a wet day involves concepts, but those concepts alone are not sufficient to enable someone make this articulation that Tuesday was a wet day. Immediately this statement reflects an experiential background, and if shared with testimonials, there is little doubt about the wetness of the day. If shared with testimonials, the moment somebody says Tuesday was a wet day, I would ask, was it really? Oh, what did you do? Did you do rain dance? And if somebody says, yes, I performed rain dance, it was really marvelous to perform rain dance, and I got totally drenched, and one goes on giving details which would become testimonial, in that case, I would have no choice. I would have to say that, yes, probably Tuesday was a wet day. And I need to probably confirm with some other folks. And if they all say that, yes, Tuesday was a wet day, there was good shower on Tuesday, and therefore some respite from this scorching heat, probably I would believe that, yes, Tuesday was a wet day. It would become part of my knowledge system. If shared with testimonials, there is little doubt about the wetness of the day called Tuesday. Likewise, when recorded in history, in the formal field of historical knowledge, when these synthetic statements are brought in history with adequate testimonials, they become crucial part, they become milestones in history, substantial information in history. That's a very interesting idea. Why? Because we tend to think that history has nothing to do with this kind of conjecturing or discussion based on experiences. The whole field of historiography, the discussion, critical debates on the craft and art of doing history, that would probably unfold some of these ideas. But here it's with Immanuel Kant's discussion on the category of synthetic proposition, we begin to understand that even within the formal field of history, it is with adequate testimonials that experiences of past are presented as milestones, as indubitable statements. Say for example, something so much familiar to many of the students who read textbooks on history, something like Napoleon was a great general, right? If you say Napoleon was a great general, probably you have substantial amount of testimonials in the backdrop of this statement to support this idea, and therefore anybody who hears it would probably like to go to see what are those testimonials in support of this statement, and when they come across testimonials, they would say, yeah, it makes sense, Napoleon was a great general. In Kant's words, and I quote him, Kant says, all bodies, this is under quote, if I say all bodies are extended, then this is an analytic statement, analytic judgment, analytic proposition. So, the quote goes like this: all bodies are extended, then this is an analytic judgment, for I do not need to go outside the concept that I combine with the word body. I don't have to go outside the words which are used with the word body, they are sufficient. So, I don't have to go to go outside the concept that I combine with the word body in order to find that extension connected with it. I don't have to go outside with this statement to understand the extension connected with the word body, but rather I need only to analyze that concept, that is, become conscious of the manifold that I always think in it. In order to encounter this predicate therein, on the contrary, if I say all bodies are heavy, then the predicate is something entirely different from that which I think is the mere concept of a body in general. The addition of such a predicate thus yields a synthetic judgment. Quote ends. I repeat the quote for the convenience of listener. All bodies are extended, then this is an analytic judgment, for I do not need to go outside the concept that I combine with the word body in order to find that extension connected with it, but rather I need only to analyze that concept, that is, become conscious of the manifold that I always think in it, it is body, in order to encounter this predicate therein. On the contrary, if I say all bodies are heavy, then the predicate is something entirely different from that which I think is the mere concept of a body in general. The addition of such a predicate thus yields a synthetic judgment. It is very clear that one kind of statement, all bodies are extended, do not require you to take help from anywhere else. You just need to look at the words in that statement and it would be crystal clear. Whereas, if you say all bodies are heavy, then the heaviness of body requires you to get into debate, employ some other kind of concepts to explain this idea, to amplify your understanding coming from this statement. And this is the crucial difference between analytic proposition, analytic judgment and synthetic judgment, synthetic proposition. And this whole explanation given by Kant becomes very, very crucial. These are the nut bolts for Kant to develop his understanding of the character of knowledge and act of knowing. This is clear from the examples that analytic judgments don't amplify. Analytic judgments, say for example, as I said in many of those examples, and I just pick all bodies are extended. Now, analytic judgment such as this would not amplify our cognition, it will clarify our cognition. It does not add things from outside, it makes it clearer. For whatever it is said, you get clearer about it. So, it does not amplify our cognition, it sets out and makes more intelligible concept which we already have in that judgment. This aids for sure in clarifying, whereas synthetic judgment gives more than the concept of the subject for our cognition. It takes you to more than the concepts which are already there in the statement. This entails the role of experience and thereby to reason with the additional concept. Because you have experience coming into picture, of course, reason would take you in various directions and reason would dwell upon a variety of experiential narratives. Each experiential narrative may have various kind of conceptual coordinates, and when one can understand how dramatic amplification could happen on the basis of a synthetic statement. Facts of history, empirical details of geography and science, and many other such fields are in the category of the synthetic propositions for Immanuel Kant. Facts of history, empirical details in geography and science too, synthetic propositions where it becomes necessary for you to indulge yourself in debates and try to amplify your meanings, your interpretations, your understanding. Without that amplification, probably facts would remain raw material. So, facts of history, facts of science, because of being their synthetic nature, invite critical debates. These are empirical propositions emerging from and backed by observational data. In science, you have empirical propositions which would emerge from a very rigorous method that you have employed and the observational data that you have arrived at. This is all fine. This all looks clearer, but there is something that Immanuel Kant comes to discuss. It's a very tricky idea that creates a lot of interesting pathways. It starts, it invites us to go on interesting kind of rumination. It's a tricky idea. It's a possibility of synthetic a priori judgment, a synthetic judgment which involves a priori knowledge. The intertwined opposites as they seem, basically they are suggesting that there can be a speculative a priori which would depend on the concepts, and a speculative a priori depending on the concepts could summon us, could invite us to seek for causes, other set of concepts that would be possible through experience. I repeat, a speculative a priori depending on the concepts could summon us to seek for causes, other sets of concepts that would be possible through experience. A knowledge without such mixing, this kind of mixing is almost essential, it is going to happen. However, there is also a possibility that there would be a body of knowledge without such mixing, and Kant says a knowledge without such mixing would be a pure a priori, and a pure a priori calls for pure cognition, pure reason, in which principles of cognition are a priori, in which principles of cognition are already a given. And I quote Immanuel Kant in this regard, it is important to quote him here. An organum of pure reason would be a sum total of those principles in accordance with which all pure a priori cognitions can be acquired and actually brought about. I call all cognition transcendental, that occupied not so much the objects, but rather with our a priori concept of objects in general. A system of such concepts would be called transcendental philosophy. So, according to Immanuel Kant, as I said, I repeat, an organum of pure reason would be a sum total of those principles in accordance with which all pure a priori cognitions can be acquired and actually brought about. I call all cognition transcendental, that occupied not so much the objects, but rather with our a priori concept of objects in general. A system of Such concepts would be called transcendental philosophy. So, what is happening? Unlike the pure and speculative reason of transcendental philosophy, there is a practical domain fraught with motives related to feelings belonging to the empirical sources of cognition. So, there are two worlds of knowledge again, as it seems. One is where transcendental nature of cognition would be useful. There is one world where transcendental philosophy is more significant than the other world, where you come across very muddied, very realistic, very complicated, very greyish kind of materials. Unlike the pure and speculative reason of transcendental philosophy, this practical domain, this practical everyday life is where we encounter fraught character of motives. We come across very loaded kind of feelings. They will all belong to empirical sources of cognition, but they would have a lot of psycho-emotional orientation. These are objects outside. This is the world out there, and this world out there in this case becomes crucial for the senses inside. So, there is a world out there which we try to approach with our senses, which are in here. This involves doctrine of methods of practical reasons. Doctrine of methods of practical reason is as important for Immanuel Kant as is transcendental philosophy. And this doctrine of methods, this practical reason, enables us to investigate into our domain of experiences. This is a domain of experience where we have motives, where we have meanings, where we have actors operating with structures, structures operating on actors, etc., etc. And it is this world where we need to employ practical reason. Roughly, this is the domain of experiences dominated by perceptions, the phenomenon. This is not dependent on the accidents. Rather, this world, this domain of knowledge has a pattern and a calculable frequency. Things are set there. Frequency of people meeting, frequency of events happening, these are all predictable now. Everything is so set, and it appears a priori in the sense that it does not always require experience to vouch for it. You don't always say that I would say that there is world only if I experience that world. You don't say that. So, there is a world out there with this kind of mechanism, this kind of social arrangement, this kind of structured and getting structured personality. There are institutions and all. This whole world out there is indeed taken for granted by us, that yes, this was there, this is there, and probably this will be like this, always there. And that does not require experience to vouch for it. This is what we mean. We take it for granted. We understand that it's there. On the other hand, and that is largely something which appears as phenomena in Kantian formulation. But on the other hand, there is something called noumena, and noumena are things in themselves. They are fraught with accidental occurrences. It is very difficult to predict their occurrence. It is very difficult to calculate their frequency, and they are also very subjective in nature. They are almost like subjective sensations. and they are grasped with pure intuitions. You cannot always be sure about them in terms of having proof, testimonial, evidences, verification. You cannot always prove the veracity of them. However, you know, and you know it very strongly through your pure intuitions, you know that it is there, right? Noumena is there. They are things in themselves. They are fraught with accidental occurrences. They are very subjective in nature. They are almost like subjective sensations, and we get to them only through pure intuitions. Needless to say, it is seldom possible to be sure about understanding noumena. Say, for example, a mystics experience, or a madman's fantasy, or a dreamer's dreaming, or a thinker's utopia, etc., etc. They may not be concretely accessible, I mean, in the sense that you cannot translate their experiences into a very cogent prose and say that this is what the experience was. You can make a rough attempt and have some fragment of those experiences on paper, but translating, re-narrating, recollecting those experiences entirely is a very difficult claim to make. So, those experiences are also there, and they are equally important experience. However, we have limitation in recalling them entirely as a full piece. So, this is where we are. Despite recognizing the role of a priori and intuition based observations, he has recognized their significance. But despite that recognition, Immanuel Kant reminds us of the limits of it. And he says, I quote, "Mathematics gives us a splendid example of how far we can go with a priori cognition independently of experience." Look at the beauty of Kantian engagement. He targets mathematics here. I repeat, mathematics gives us a splendid example of how far we can go with a priori cognition independently of experience. Likewise, Plato abandoned the world of senses because it posed so many hindrances for the understanding and dared to go beyond it on the wings of the ideas in the empty space of pure understanding. Very interesting kind of position that appears from this. Plato abandoned the world of the senses because it posed so many hindrances for the and what did Plato do? He wanted to understand the world. He went on the wings of the ideas in the empty space of pure understanding. Unlimited horizons he might have crossed, but those unlimited horizons are not available to our sense organs for recollection, and therefore, what's the point of going on such a long flight on this wild exploration? So, likewise, like mathematics, so in Plato, and so in any of those domains of experiences where things cannot be recollected, are put aside as okay, it's there, it's part of the domain of experience, but you know what, may not be so suitable for scientific inquiry, and hence it is advisable that scientific inquiries would, in any domain of understanding, operate with reason and analyze concepts, the objects in the external world. So, despite all kind of just recognitions, acknowledgement, despite the fact that Kant does not dismiss a lot of materials, lot of components of experiences, but some of those materials are secondary as one can see in the Kantian scheme of things. However, it is with Kant that a clean idea of scientific epistemology emerges for our consideration. Things are more or less settled with Kant. The whole body of Enlightenment philosophy can be celebrated for some reason, but one also has to take note of some of those things which would otherwise be considered subsidiary or derivative in Enlightenment philosophy. What we have done in this lecture is that with the two temporally distanced philosophical stances of René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, and in between some slices of empiricism and skepticism, we have seen that there emerges a synoptic sense of epistemology of modern science, a modern scientific way of seeing. This was a key consequence of the Enlightenment. There is a 20th century philosopher, Ernst Cassirer. He presented a congratulatory note summarizing the philosophical achievements of the Enlightenment. And I quote Cassirer here: "The permanent results of this philosophy do not lie in teachings. They do not lie in teachings which it develops and tries to formulate into a body of dogma. Far more than the men of the epoch were aware, their teachings were dependent on the preceding centuries. Enlightenment philosophy simply fell heir to the heritage of those centuries. It ordered, sifted, developed and clarified this heritage, rather than contributed and gave currency to new and original ideas. Yet, in spite of this dependence with respect to content, the Enlightenment produced a completely original form of philosophic thought." Interesting. Even when it reworks prevailing ideas, when it merely continues to build on a foundation laid by the 17th century, as is the case with its cosmology. Everything takes on new meaning and appears in a new perspective. Quote ends. Cassirer has done a wonderful, revisiting of the Enlightenment philosophy, and he tries to show the kind of negotiation that happens between the preceding contributions in body of philosophy and the Enlightenment contribution of the Enlightenment philosophers. In this complex outcome, a new methodological order emerges and it begins to dominate 18th century thought. One goes on reading Cassirer's take on the Enlightenment, and one gets informed that the attempt to solve the central problem of philosophic method involves recourse to Newton's rules of philosophizing rather than to Descartes' discourse on method. Newton gets more important than Descartes here. So, Newton's rule of philosophizing becomes more important than Descartes' discourse on method, with the result that philosophy presently takes an entirely new direction in this kind of regime of Newtonianism. Philosophy takes entirely new direction, for Newton's method is not that of pure deduction, but that of analysis. Reason thereby is not an inheritance from metaphysics. It becomes an acquisition with methodological rigor, and thus Newton was ennobled to the methodological supremacy known as Newtonianism. So, this is an interesting story about scientific epistemology, where despite many philosophers coming together, presenting their cases and contributing, is Newton, the practitioner of science, who is also a philosopher par excellence, gets to be more important. He sets the methodological regime modeled after what Newton has done and what Newton advocates to be done. But then if one takes a long jump in history and looks at the time when the world was facing Second World War, one gets a sense of the discontents of the Enlightenment. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno diagnosed in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, Philosophical Fragments, this is the title of their work, they diagnosed, and this was first published in 1944, Horkheimer's and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment, Philosophical Fragments. It was first published in 1944, and they have diagnosed the issues with the Enlightenment, the category of reason thereof. This was followed by, again, by Horkheimer, a discussion on eclipse of reason, in which Horkheimer continued to show the problem of reason in the wake of Enlightenment. In short, they showed that the Enlightenment is totalitarian. Their methodological order, the scientific epistemology, the philosophical normative orientation generated by them is totalitarian in nature, in the sense that it does not expect anything else to come in the frame of Enlightenment. Even though they are there, they would be hidden somewhere, they would be repressed somewhere. Moreover, there was a perpetual thinking on the normative conditioning and consequences of science, philosophy and the Enlightenment. A sociologist such as Robert Merton, a significant name in sociology of science, a significant name often mentioned in methodological debate to talk about grounded theories and all, a middle range theory. Robert Merton placed science at intersections of religion, politics and social institutions. He showed the rise of science in 17th century England as essentially preconditioned by pietism, a stream within Christianity. So that was a way to show that science was not independent of the article of faith, the institutions of faith, and the system, social system, which is governed by law, norms, customs and so many other things. And in this wake, this is important to join a sociologist such as Zygmunt Bauman in posing a relevant question. And the question was about the idea of sociological enlightenment. He asks, for whom, about what? This sociological enlightenment, for whom and about what? Bauman helps us realize the control of the less philosophers, the cultural intellectual elites who controlled the project of enlightenment in 18th century. Thereof philosophy and science deemed nature to be a numb entity on which they could inscribe meanings, and in doing so they marginalized the lay people as the scientists and their philosopher adopted self-referentiality of scientific narrative. And this is a very powerful critique, no doubt about that. Thus, it is natural, before we conclude this lecture, we have to be reminded, it is natural that some of the forerunners of social sciences and sociology in particular tend to engage, respond and negotiate with the new methodology as well as inheritance of philosophical propositions. And this tends to be the case even with the trinity in classical sociology. The trinity, namely Emile Durkheim, Max Weber and Karl Marx. We will deliberate on this in the following lecture. What is important to note is that the interface of history, philosophy and sociology of science springs back with yet another episode of discussion. It comes back with yet another episode of discussion when a dispute known as positivism dispute in German sociology breaks out. And that is a very significant moment in intellectual history of social sciences, particularly in a time when dispute is presented in negative connotation. It is always interesting to revisit some of those historically significant disputes which shaped the way we see things in social sciences. This is the dispute in which philosopher, historian, sociologists, they locked their horns and over the nature of science, and that paved the way for something more to happen, some advances to happen in the field of social sciences. This lecture will end here. Thank you.